good afternoon, and welcome to the third and last session of today's Interact Global, the free virtual edition of Nomensa's Interact conference. Hello, if it's your first session of today, or welcome back if you've been watching sessions over the last 2 days. We've already had two very interesting sessions today with Tanya Ramos from OutSystems about behavioral science, and the recorded sessions due to unforeseen circumstances from Pete Trainer. He presented at the Interact London in 2018 with his talk, More Than Humanly Possible. If you haven't been able to join the sessions, you will find it on our YouTube channel later in the week. Before we start, please to get involved and say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure you switch your chat settings to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any audio issues or any issues with the stream, and we'll try to get things solved for you as soon as possible. We are also using auto-generated captions for this session. Some of these may not be 100% accurate. However, when we'll share the talks publicly on our YouTube channel, we'll ensure the transcripts are accurate. Now, we're really excited for our third talk on this rainy Tuesday afternoon, at least here in the Netherlands. This talk is about the art and science of asking questions, from Dan Brown, information architect and principal at EightShapes. In his talk, Dan will draw on decades of experience to reflect on questions we use day in and day out to get input from users, gather domain knowledge, solicit feedback from colleagues, and run brainstorming sessions. Our questions have a purpose. The type of information they will bring into focus, they have an intent, a desired effect on the relationship between asker and answerers. And they may be tweaked and adjusted, the framing of the question itself, to meet both purpose and intent. By the end of this talk, you will have a greater appreciation for the question, which is the most important tool in our toolbox. Please to ask a lot of questions using the Q&A box. I will be asking these to Dan at the end, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Manuela, and thanks to the whole Nomensa team for having me at Interact. I'm really excited to be here. This is a new topic I'm exploring, so we're all kind of going on this little journey together. So I'm going to talk to you today about the art and science of asking questions. But first, let's think about what is the role of the question in user experience. Why in user experience practice do we make use of questions? And I'm going to start this conversation by asking you a question, and maybe you can put your answers in the chat. What do designers want? What is it that we really, really want? Again, drop your answers in the chat. I promise you someone is reading those answers. If you said seat at the table, you get extra swag in your bag. Why? Why do designers keep asking for a seat at the table? What is it about this presence, this participation, that is so important to us? Some people say that they want to have a seat at the table so designers can have a voice, right? So they can participate in the decision-making process, right? Ultimately, when I hear these things, when I hear having a voice, influencing decisions, what I'm hearing is they want to provide answers. But I find this puzzling, because when I think about user experience, what I think about is not so much the answers that we provide, but the means by which we ask a lot of questions. That, in fact, user experience is as much about asking questions as it is about having the answers. One view of design, one way to define it, is to think about it as a means for bringing together multiple perspectives, right? If we are a user experience designer, then it is not only our role, but it is our responsibility to listen and hear what other people need or want out of the product that we're designing. We ask, we get answers, and we turn those answers into a meaningful product. Questions are everywhere in user experience. You can't do a user experience activity without questions being involved. All of these activities that I've listed on the screen involve asking questions, from the very obvious user interviews where we ask questions of hopefully members of our target audience, to brainstorming where we ask people to imagine, what do you think this product could be? All of these processes, all of these activities involve asking questions. Let's look at discovery specifically. Discovery is an area of the design process that I have a lot of interest in, and I've thought a lot about. Discovery is like the ultimate question asking process in design. And to better understand how discovery works, I developed this model to help us understand why we do the things we do in discovery. Like most of my models, it's a 2x2. It takes into account the idea that in design we are creating divergent ideas and then converging on a single solution. It takes into account the idea that as part of design we need to not only craft a solution but define the problem. And that each of these quadrants represents a different kind of activity that we do in discovery. From gather, where we are collecting information that will inform the design process, to exploring, where we're drawing diagrams, sketching together, doing things to explore the possible solutions, to processing or analyzing our information that we collect, finding patterns, capturing hunches, to focusing, ultimately narrowing down and zeroing in on a particular approach. So I'm going to look at each of these quadrants and talk about the kinds of questions that we ask when we're doing each of these activities. So in gather, in this part of the discovery process, we're conducting primary and secondary research. We're collecting inputs for the design process. And in that phase, we might ask ourselves questions like, what are the gaps in my knowledge, right? This is not a question you ask you might ask other folks, what are the gaps in my knowledge? But this is really a moment to reflect and ask yourself, what are the gaps in my knowledge? And what we might do is ask someone else, can you tell me more about a certain domain or a certain topic, something that you feel like is lacking, right? So the idea behind gather is to collect inputs for the design process. Process is the word that I'm using to mean analyze, right? We're analyzing our observations and we're generating insights about the data that we've just collected, right? So you might ask yourself, what is the most important thing here? What is the most important thing that I learned? And in engaging others in this process, you might ask them, how would you prioritize these insights? Of everything you learned, how would you prioritize? What is the most important aspect to you? Let's look at explore. Explore is generating wide-ranging concepts. It's generating and recombining ideas. It's allowing our brains to literally explore the possibilities. We might ask ourselves, what if we created a product that did something, right? What if we created a product to help users process applications for getting into college, right? And what we might ask people is something more pragmatic, more grounded. We might ask others who are participating in this process, what would you want to see on this screen? So again, there's this interesting dichotomy in every phase of the discovery process. Questions that we ask ourselves to encourage ourselves to pursue the goals of that, and questions that we ask others to engage other people in that part of the process. The last quadrant in discovery that explains the different kinds of discovery activities that we do is focus. This is where we zero in on a specific approach. We take all the myriad ideas that we've created and we zero in on a particular approach to solving the problem. We're clarifying our priorities and we're establishing a plan. We might ask ourselves, all right, how do I make this real? And when we engage others in that process, we ask them, what resources can you dedicate to this project. When it's time to focus, we ask questions to help people see what it takes to build something, right? We're asking questions to help them move from the conceptual to the real, from the conceptual phase to something that allows them to build it. My point here was simply to say, using this framework to understand what the discovery process looks like or how we engage in discovery, we can recognize the wide variety of questions that we ask, with the emphasis on questions that we ask ourselves and questions that we ask other people. I hope it's clear that there are questions in every quadrant here, that there's questions in every kind of activity. And this is a good time to revisit what my friend Erika Hall said. She said the designer's most important tool is the question. So now that we've looked at questions, let's look at the other part of this, that the question is the most important tool. What does it mean when we call something a tool? Not someone a tool, when we call something a tool. By the way, this was a model that I developed in the last book I wrote called Practical Design Discovery. It came out a few years ago from A Book Apart. And if you want to learn more about this model, you can read more about it there. But let's talk now about tools. We use lots of tools, right? We use presentation software, we use design software, we use spreadsheets, we use things to help us write, we use things to help us prototype our concepts. There are lots and lots of tools in our toolbox. It might be hard to imagine the question among these, right? The question seems out of place among all of these digital tools that we put in our toolbox. When we think about a tool, we think about what it can do, its capabilities, and we think about what it can't do, its constraints. This is knowing the purpose of the tool, what role it plays in our process. We think about how to apply it to a given problem, right? We think about how to make use of it in what we're trying to accomplish. This is knowing how to configure the tool, how to use the tool. And last, we think about how to integrate it into our work, how to make it an extension of our own intent. That is the expertise and experience. So we've got, every tool has a purpose, a configuration, and intention. So when I look at something like Sketch, I can ask myself, do I know its features and its capabilities as well as its constraints? Do I know how to make use of it? And do I know how, do I have enough expertise in it to allow it to realize my intention? So maybe we can ask the same questions in a sense. Maybe we can apply the same model to a question, right? If a question is a tool, then surely it must have a purpose, a configuration, and an intention. And in fact, the purpose of a question is the information that you get in response to that question. The configuration of the question is the different ways to ask it. And the intention is the way a question reinforces a relationship between you and the person you're asking. So we can use this as a framework to think about how to ask better questions. So let's talk about that right now. How do we ask better questions? I want to be super clear. Earlier, I made the distinction between questions that we ask ourselves and questions that we ask others. So I've done a lot of work in higher education here in the US. And so we'll ask ourselves questions like, how do college admissions officers really evaluate applications? Or what if they could prioritize the applications that they're looking at through machine learning? Right? These are interesting, introspective questions that allow us to explore possibilities. But these are not questions that I would ask someone in that domain. There's a fantastic book called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger that explores these sort of what-if questions that you might ask yourself as a way to precipitate the design process. But for the remainder of this conversation, I want to focus on the questions that I ask other people. So if I'm interviewing someone involved in college admissions, I might have in the back of my head, how do college admissions officers evaluate applications? But what I might actually ask them is a different question. The last time you evaluated an application, what was your first step? And then they will tell me. So now, knowing that we are focusing on questions that we ask other people, let's talk about the purpose, the configuration, and the intention of a question. Let's talk about how do we make use of this model to think very carefully about the way in which we ask. We'll start first with a question's purpose, right? The ultimate purpose of a question is to bring information into the world so that we can share it, right? So that we can make use of that information. But there are different kinds of information that you want to bring into the world. So truly understanding what the ultimate purpose of your question is can help you frame it, right? Help you figure out how you want to ask it. As I sat and thought about the different kinds of questions that I ask throughout my process, I came up with these 5 categories of purpose, right? 5 kinds of information that I want to bring into the world. The first is questions that validate, right? Questions that help me confirm my understanding of a particular domain or topic. They're questions that help me expand my knowledge, right? Questions that help me plumb the depths of a particular domain so that I can learn more detail about it. They're questions that clarify, so domains are complicated, right? Or are filled with nuance. So there are questions that I ask to help clarify things that are confusing to me. Sometimes I ask a question not so much because I'm interested in the output of that question or the response that I get, but to help the person I'm asking switch their mind frame, right? Switch their the frame of mind. So I call these questions that prime. They help me set the stage for a new topic that I might be asking. And lastly, I might ask a question that opens the possibilities, right? That encourages people to think more broadly about a problem, to brainstorm about a solution, or to judge opportunities that are put in front of them. So let's look at some examples of these. A few years ago, I was working on a product for a children's book publisher. The product was meant to help bridge the gap between kids and what they're reading and the parents' interest in what they're reading, right? To sort of create a stronger connection. So I ran a bunch of user interviews, and one of the questions I asked was, when was the last time you read to your child? Now, this was really validation because almost all parents and caregivers that I know read to their child before bedtime, right? Specifically this age group that we were looking at. To a certain extent, that was a hunch that I had, so I wanted to validate that, but it also gave me new information. As I talked to folks who did not come from my demographic or my background, I learned new things about the different ways in which people read to their children. When I want to ask questions that plumb the depths, that give me a deeper understanding of a topic, I can ask, tell me about a time that you used that information in a conversation with a colleague, right? So this is a kind of question where I have a sense of what the information is, but I really want to understand how did they make use of that information. Questions help me understand an ambiguous topic. So I was doing work for a pharmaceutical company earlier this year. There was a lot of nuance in how clinical trials are run. So I'm really trying to help my understanding of how clinical trials work. And again, sometimes I ask a question not so much to get specific information out of it, but to help the participant shift their mindset. So if I'm talking to a participant about how they do their work, and I want to switch from sort of day-to-day work to how do they think about kind of the next year of their work, I might ask something like, what are your main milestones on your roadmap for the next 12 months? It's a fairly simple question. It's a little bit of a softball, we might say, but it helps shift their mindset from where they are right now, the day to day, to where will they be in 12 months' time. And the last purpose that I identified is opening up new ideas, right? Judging opportunities, drawing people into the process to allow them to explore possible solutions, right? And so I can ask a question like, how might you reorganize this screen to see if the participant can offer me any new ideas? So now comes the audience participation part. I bet no one told you there was going to be some audience participation. So let's say you wanted to learn more about someone's hobby. And it turns out that modern circumstances have enabled lots of people to pursue hobbies that maybe they didn't necessarily give themselves time to pursue before. And let's say you found out that a friend of yours has a new hobby. How might you learn more about that hobby? So think about one of these hobbies. I've given some examples on the left-hand side here, but maybe ask a question that confirms a hunch, or ask a question that lets you explore the depths of that hobby, or ask a question that allows them to explore the possibilities of that hobby. So I'm going to take a water break, and I'm going to give you a couple seconds to write that question down. And if you want to share the question that you write about a hobby, feel free to put it in the chat. So I'm going to take a drink of water, post your questions to the chat, and then we'll move on. All right, so let's say you know someone has a hobby. They've taken up playing board games. I know many people who have taken up board games. So if I was asking a question that would help validate, I might say, I understand that board games are going through a resurgence. Is that true? If I wanted to ask a question that plumbs the depths, I might ask, what is the last board game you played several times in a row? What drew you to it? So not just playing board games, but playing board games a lot. And if I wanted to ask a question that opened up the possibilities, I might ask, I hear they're putting some board games on smartphones. Is that right? Which ones have you tried? Rachel Thompson posted a question that said, what are the first steps in baking a loaf of bread? And I love that question because all of my attempts to bake a loaf of bread, every time I read a new recipe, it feels like the first steps are a little bit different every time. So I would really love to learn that question. So keep posting questions. If you've written one down, spoiler alert, we're going to make some changes to that question in later slots. So let's talk about a question's intention. A question's intention is to reinforce the relationship between the interviewer and the participant. And I have came up with three ways in which we might reinforce the relationship between folks. The first is to empathize with them, to show them that you understand. I call empathize the E word. It's an overused word in our world. And so I don't necessarily put a lot of stock in this idea that we're actually empathizing with them. I do put a lot of stock in the idea that when we're asking a question, we want to show them that we understand. So a few years ago, I was working on a career guidance type product, and having been well in my 40s, I think my career was pretty much set by then, but I had the opportunity to interview some high school students, some teenagers, and so I wanted them to know that I've been in that position where I felt like, the world was this big, scary place out in front of me. And even though I was at the beginning of this journey, I knew that I had lots of possibilities. So I asked them, I know it must seem like a career is so far away. Do you see anything that gets you excited about planning ahead? But when so that was how I positioned this question to empathize with them by saying, I know it must seem like a career is so far away. When you're talking to 15 and 16-year-olds, certainly my expectation was that they weren't thinking very deeply about their careers at that point. I was proven wrong, by the way. So another intention is to show them that you're here to learn, right? So you can show them that you are engaged by using the keywords that I use is to say, I'm curious. So again, with the career guidance tool, when I was interviewing teenagers, I was genuinely curious about what it was like to be a teenager in the 21st century, because I was literally a teenager in the entire last century. So how does seeing, I said, I have no idea what it must be like to be a teenager growing up in the 21st century. How does seeing these things, that is the things on the screen, fit into your view of the world? We had certain expectations about what people wanted to see because we were working from a frame that was very much our own mindset. And then the last intention here is to build trust, to show them that you're vulnerable, right? To reveal your own lack of understanding of what's going on. And the phrase I like to use is, I need your help. So I might say to the teenagers, I need your help fine-tuning the information we're showing about each career. Let's go through each column and tell me what each one means to you. So these three intentions are different ways that you can fine-tune a question to try and build the relationship. You don't need to incorporate all three. What I'm saying is maybe there's an opportunity to show them that you're curious, or show them that you want to engage with them, build trust with them, or show them that you understand. So how can you take your last question, the question that you just wrote before me, and change it slightly to show that you understand where they're coming from, or that you're here to learn, or that you are vulnerable, right? You want to build trust with them. So once again, I'm going to take a water break. You're going to think about this and maybe post your revised question to the chat. I love water breaks. Rachel, that was awesome. So I'm not even going to show my example because Rachel was like, I need your help. I want to make garlic bread. Where do I start? I love that example, right? Creating this connection with someone, showing you're vulnerable. I really have no idea how to make bread. It's been 2 years we've been dealing with this. Everybody's making sourdough bread and I don't know where to start. I need your help. I love that. Travis said, when was the last time a video game blew your mind? I haven't really played video games since I was a kid. Walk me through what you're feeling. I really like that, right? So it's like, this was a hobby I had at one point. I know the hobby has evolved a lot. Can you help me understand what's cool these days? To engage with my board game question, I said, I'm really interested in how people play some games again and again and others just sit on the shelf. What was the last board game you played several times in a row? What drew you to it? So the preamble for this question sets things up to say, I'm genuinely interested in learning more about why this phenomenon happens. All right, so the last thing that we're going to look at is the configuration, right? These are the way the question itself is constructed to serve the purpose and the intention. We talked purpose, the kind of information that I want to gather, the intention, how you want to support the relationship between you and the participant. How do you fine-tune what's in the question to serve both the purpose and the intention? Here's the thing. And if you read any advice on how to conduct a user interview, say you're going to see a lot of the same kinds of patterns And you're going to see a lot of things that you should not do. So that's where I wanted to start in this configuration discussion. You'll see things like yes, no questions are bad. Make it open-ended, right? And I worry about advice like this because sometimes a yes, no question is the first question to pop into your head, right? Just it's a very natural way for us to form questions. So if you are going out of your way to avoid yes no questions, you may end up freezing up, right, and not ask any question, not take advantage of the situation while it's there. So instead, I would say ask the question because it turns out, shocker, people love talking about themselves. And most people, even if you ask a yes or no question, don't just say yes or no. And surprise, surprise, you can always ask a follow-up question. So even if you just get a yes, you can always say, can you tell me more about that? Or what makes you say that? I was surprised to hear you say that. You can do things to follow up. The other advice that we get is to try and make it casual, make it comfortable, make it personal, make it a conversation. And again, I don't think this is great advice because my user interviews, for example, or my stakeholder interviews are 30 minutes or 45 minutes or 60 minutes at most. I have very limited time and I may never ever speak to this person again. I'm not confident that spending a whole lot of time building up a rapport for 20 minutes just to have 10 minutes to ask the meaty questions is a good idea. Sometimes an interview bucks the norms of polite conversation, right? The whole point of inviting someone to an interview is not necessarily to have a polite, casual conversation, but to get information out of them. And the other piece of advice that people often say is don't ask leading questions. You might bias the answers. And I really feel like this, I understand why people say this, right? That we want to try and get honest responses. And there's definitely this sense that participants, no matter who they are not great at reporting on their own behavior. I totally get that. At the same time, I do feel like that kind of sells our participants short a little bit. That is, it doesn't give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think we need to recognize that our participants are self-aware, but we also may need to help them along in that process. So instead of all of these pieces of advice that I feel like their heart is in the right place, but maybe they're a little bit misguided or difficult to apply, I wanted to share with you the model that I use when I'm thinking about questions. And I think about these less as, do's and don'ts and more dials that I can turn. And this is the pinnacle of my keynote skills right there, creating those dials. So I think about scope. How much of the topic am I asking about? I think about examples. Do I want to drop an example into the question to kind of set the tone or give someone a sense of what direction I want them to go in? Do I include any context to help point the participants in the right direction? This is really important if you're changing topics, for example. You might want to drop context in to kind of help them understand that you're changing topics. And the last is perspective. From what perspective are you asking their question? Asking your question of them. So let me do a few examples of these. One more shot of these just beautiful dials. So with scope, we're asking, should I broaden or narrow the question? I do a lot of work in architectural licensing, which seems weird, but I've got a really good relationship with this organization. And this is really just the niche kind of topic that I love. And I've been working with this organization for probably close to 10 years now. So this was a tool I did not design. This was designed by another group. But we were testing it to try and understand how people understand their requirements for getting a license in the US. So I might ask something like, what are the requirements for getting licensed in Texas? It turns out it's a very, very broad question. Turns out there are lots of requirements to get your architectural license. So I narrow the scope. And when I ask instead, how would you determine what the educational requirements are for getting licensed in Texas? it's almost always get an accredited degree, but different states do it differently. So we want to be able to help people understand that if you're getting licensed in Texas versus, say, in Maryland, there are different standards. So that's scope. Let's look at example. Maybe this is a good way to encourage the participant with answers you've heard before. So sometimes in usability tests or concept testing, I'll let the participant guide me. What should we look at now? But that feels even too open-ended, right? There's so many things to look at, and they're looking at this maybe for the first time. So I'll drop some examples in. So we could look at requirements for renewing your license, or maybe look at the requirements for a different state, right? Sort of give them that kind of binary choice. So that's examples. Let's talk about how do we incorporate context into our questions. Point the participant to the right. Using context, we're pointing the participant to the right aspect of the topic. So again, if we're asking what are the requirements for getting licensed in Texas, we might actually kind of have a little bit of a preamble to set some context. Imagine you're at the beginning of the licensing process. This is different, right? If you are sort of well on your way, you've maybe taken many parts of the exam already, that's a different context. So we're at the beginning of the licensing process and you're trying to decide where do you want to get your license. Aspiring architects will go to school in one state, but end up getting licensed in a different state. And let's say one of the states you're considering is Texas, right? So now we've established some context for them, so we're not just asking this out in the middle of nowhere. And then the last dial that we can turn is where to position the participant in the question. And this is a technique that I've been using more and more because it gets the participant maybe outside of their own experience a little bit. So instead of asking what are the requirements for getting licensed in Texas, I might instead say, let's say a friend of yours was at the beginning of the licensing process. What lessons learned would you share with them? This is essentially the same question, but asking from a different perspective, asking them to think in terms of how would they relate to a friend of theirs. I'll often say, if you were teaching someone how to use this product, where would you start? Or I'll say, if you had a new employee, what are the top 3 tips you would give that employee to use this enterprise product, right? So now we're sort of getting the participant out of their own perspective and thinking differently about the product. So, are you ready to make one more change to your hobby question? So you've got your hobby question, largely about garlic bread, and I'm asking you to change the scope of the question, incorporate some examples into the question, incorporate some context into the question, or incorporate some perspective, shift their perspective on the question. So I'm going to do my water break. You're going to make some changes to your question, maybe post some examples, and we'll take a look at those. And remember, if you have questions for me at the end, feel free to post them to the Q&A, and Manuela will share those with me at the end. We should have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes left for questions at the end. All right, I'm looking for examples of how you might change one parameter on your hobby question to either broaden or narrow the scope, direct the participant with examples, point the participant in the right direction, or shift their position. All right, let's look at the board game question, and let's change the perspective. So the original question: what was the last board game you played several times in a row, and what drew you to it? I might instead say, you said your partner doesn't love board games like you do. True story. What game have you played more than once with them? What do you think draws them to it? Right? So now we're incorporating something that we've heard and we're asking them to think about someone else. So just to recap here, when we say the question is the most important tool, we have to then really explore what that metaphor means. Can we look at questions in the same way we look at any other tool? And my hypothesis here is yes, we can. We can look at the question's purpose by identifying what kinds of information we want to draw, by validating or plumbing or clarifying or priming or opening, asking questions that do those things. We want to understand what our intention is with the question, right? How are we building the relationship? How are we supporting the relationship with the participant by empathizing, engaging, or building trust? And then we want to think about, now that we've identified a purpose and an intention for each of those, how do we configure the question using scope, examples, context, and perspective? I want to leave you with kind of a big thought here. And that is that asking questions is not simply about kind of getting those bits and pieces right. That asking good questions is really about cultivating a questioning mindset. I've heard, and people have approached me and said things like, asking good questions is really about having a beginner's mind. And I'll be very honest, I don't know a lot about this topic. What I know about beginner's mind has always been sort of filtered through a very westernized perspective on it. My understanding of the definition is that it is a mind uninhibited and unbiased by experience or knowledge. And I think, again, this is a concerning metaphor for me. And I also feel like part of it, the concern is that this is an Eastern concept that's been appropriated by Western culture, and I don't know how confident I can feel in the way it's been presented to me. I also worry about this positioning of a beginner's mind, because while it gives us permission to ask simple, naive questions, those are some of my favorite kinds of questions, I think it also discounts or even demonizes knowledge and experience. I can ask better questions if I've got a stronger understanding of the subject matter, right? I can plumb the depths a lot better about bread if I understand the mechanisms of how yeast works, right? That allows me to ask better questions. If I just see yeast as another ingredient, I'm not really going to ask anything more than simple, naive questions about the bread making process. So instead of thinking in terms of beginner's mind, which may be useful for some folks, I've started thinking in terms of a questioning mindset. What is the frame of mind that I want to be in when I'm asking questions? I want to give myself permission to ask naive and basic questions, yes. But I also want to embrace my knowledge and experience. One of the reasons why I can perform well on the architectural licensing product is I've been thinking about that for a long, long time, right? And so I have a lot of depth of knowledge there. But a questioning mindset also considers the participant's experience, right? By simply asking naive questions, I might stumble upon something that is inappropriate or uncomfortable for the participant. I might ask them in a way that makes it easy for them to answer me. And a questioning mindset allows us to think in terms of how can I configure this question in the best possible way to get the answer that I need. So I see a questioning mindset as consisting of these four, let's call them attitudes, right? Humility, compassion, curiosity, and awareness. The curiosity attitude says, I want to be able to understand this topic better. That adopting a questioning mindset means embracing that inner curiosity that says, I'm genuinely interested in how people get their licenses to practice architecture. That is a hard thing to embrace, but if you can, you will ask better questions. How can I show the participant that I care? A questioning mindset entails an attitude of compassion. I want the participant to know that they are not merely a vessel of information that I'm drawing data out of, but that I care about their experience. A questioning mindset means embracing humility, that I respect the perspective that the participant is bringing to the table. And lastly, awareness is an understanding that I need to help them help me. I need to ask my questions in a way that make them comfortable, easy, meaningful for them to answer. And so when I talk about a questioning mindset, I'm talking about embracing these four attitudes: humility, curiosity, compassion, and awareness, as the foundation by which you can create and think of better questions. I will leave you with one final thought here, as we all are starting to think more deeply about how do we make the world a better place. That when we're dealing with complex systems, a questioning mindset consisting of humility and curiosity and compassion and awareness is really the means by which we recognize that there's more to a system than meets the eye, that there's more going on behind the simple questions that we can ask, that there's a lot more going on under the surface that we need to truly understand what's happening in that system, that we want to be able to gain more than a superficial understanding of how the system works so we can slap a product on top of it and say we've done our jobs. We want to uncover those deeper connections because that sets us up for dismantling the system so that we can build it back into something even better. That is my final thought. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. You are welcome to tweet at me. I'm at Brownorama on Twitter, and I'm always interested in hearing how you apply these to your own job. So you may email me at dan@eightshapes.com. And I just want to give a little plug for a video series that I've just wrapped up called A Lens a Day. These are conversations that I've had with 51 different practitioners of information architecture. They're short 25-minute videos about IA, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. And you can find all of these videos at the Twitter handle IA Lenses, or anchor.fm/alensaday, or on 8Shapes YouTube channel. So thanks for allowing me to plug that, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you for that, Dan. Real useful and insightful presentation. So if anyone has questions for Dan, please submit them now in the Q&A box. I see there already have been 2 submitted, so I will read them to you. So we have a question from Simon, from our CEO. Great talk. Asking questions is a super skill, no doubt. What are your thoughts about asking the same questions to different people that have different levels of responsibility and time requirements? For example, CEO or board members of a corporation or a manager within the organization?
Simon, thanks for that question. I think this really touches on that questioning mindset that I ended with. This notion of awareness is really what comes to mind for me, that we can't simply ask everyone the exact same questions. Let me rephrase. We can ask everyone the exact same questions. We can expect different answers. But I think that cultivating an awareness of the different perspectives that people have, as something as simple as where they sit in the organization, I think allows you to get maybe greater nuance or greater understanding. One way I might structure that is when I create scripts for those interviews, I might start with the same sets of questions and then add variations to those questions on each script, or even within the same script, to identify, hey, I want to ask, the CEO or any executive a slightly different version of this question, or a different follow-up question based on what I hear in the initial response.
I got another question from Simon. How do you rate or prioritize answers to the same questions from different people?
How do I rate or prioritize the same questions from different answers to the same questions from different people? So when I'm doing user research, what I'm looking for is patterns. So what I might do is compile all the kind of observations that I make and that others make as part of it, and look through those and identify where did we see some consistencies and where did we see some inconsistencies in the those responses. My user research process is really just trying to form a picture of the ecosystem and the nature of the usage or the nature of how people engage in a process so that we can design a product to best support it. Understanding that, depending on how you put it, we're not going to make everyone perfectly happy, but we are going to try and understand and empathize, try and understand the perspectives that they bring to the table. If I did need to prioritize, I might say something like, well, I talked to a dozen folks in the user interviews. I generally saw these kinds of patterns. This was a very strong pattern that I saw. Here are some of the weaker patterns that I saw.
Thank you. We have another question regarding the many kinds of telehealth, teledentistry apps with similar features. What do you think could be asked in ways to make a differentiation in creating such apps?
Well, I don't know. That feels a little bit like a question that a client might ask me. I don't know specifically about those kinds of apps because I don't know a whole lot about the domain, but the process that I might use is to watch people either make appointments or engage in the app itself and try and identify where the most difficult parts of that process are. I might ask them about prior experiences that they've had with that. And if I were asking kind of a opening or an exploring question, I might ask them to reflect on what kinds of features that they would find most useful. But I feel a little uncomfortable answering that kind of question because it seems very, very, very specific to a very specific thing, and that's very much part of a design process is to kind of go deep on those very specific kinds of applications.
Cool, thank you. I got a question. If the deck can be shared, then will it be able to send us a PDF that we can share with the participants? Would it be possible?
I generally don't share my slide decks, but the recording is being shared on YouTube, right? So
exactly, it will be later in the week. That will be on YouTube, exactly, so that it can be replayed for everyone. Then I get a new questions. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Abhinav is asking, in your experience, do questions based on assumptions perform better than ones that are open-ended? Does it primarily depend on the context of the questions as well? Thanks.
that's a really good question. I think I would. So one framing that I often use is if I know that I'm asking a question based on an assumption, I will be very honest about that. I'll be transparent with the participant and I'll say something like, look, I've always thought X. Or I might say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so keep me honest, right? I try and use that kind of framing to give them permission to disagree with me. And I'm not sure there's the dichotomy that you're drawing between assumption questions and open-ended questions. I mean, everything that comes out of your mouth is based on a set of assumptions. So I think the distinction that you're making is if you're being transparent about your assumptions, right? Being super clear about, look, this is what I understand, because it can feel like those questions are somewhat leading, right? You're just asking for people to say yes, to put a check mark on your assumption. And what you really want them to do is unpack your assumption. So I would literally invite them to do that. I would literally say, here's my assumption, or here's something that I've always believed, or here's something that I've come to understand, but I'm not sure I got it right. Can you help me unpack this? So it's a good thought, and I think it's sort of the crux of the issue of how do we create a foundation in an interview setting for people to be honest with us and to kind of break down some of the social pressures that exist in these situations where people don't want to disagree, say, with the interviewer.
Perfect, thank you. So I think we reached the end of all the questions. So if anyone has more questions for Dan, just like reach out to him as he mentioned earlier. Thank you very much, Dan, for this interesting session.
Sure,
The
thank
next
you.
session will be tomorrow, 10 a.m. UK time. Tomorrow's sessions will be about user experience and design and will be kicked off from Rui Couto, product designer at OutSystems, and we'll talk about bridging the gap between academia and industry. We have come to the end. Thank you for joining. See you all tomorrow. And if you haven't signed up, do that. You can still do that. Still time to do it on Eventbrite. Thank you very much. See you all tomorrow. Have a good day.